Hello and welcome. The world is seeing unprecedented economic crisis. Japan has gone into recession. Let me introduce my guest today who is very closely associated with Japan. His name is Nobuhisa Ishizuka. Nobuhisa is Executive Director of Center for Legal Studies with Columbia Law School. Thank you very much, Nobu. I think it's really an honor that you could spare some time and talk to us. And I'm sure your viewpoint is going to be very helpful to people who are listening to this. So I really welcome you today and thank you very much for being there.
Well, Balbir, thank you very much for this invitation. It's a real pleasure for me to be here with you.
Thank you. So let me start with first, I think your home country, Japan. If we see, Japan has seen multiple recessions because of various reasons, and this time this virus has put Japan in another kind of trouble. And Japan largely is an export-driven economy, which has not a big market like India for consumption. And the entire world is locked down. And we don't know when this lockdown is going to end. Do you see that this time the recession is far more threatening than what Japan has seen in the previous round?
I think Japan is not immune to the same shocks that many other countries are facing, and perhaps even more so. Japan was headed for a economic headwind even before the crisis hit. In the last quarter of 2019, you may be aware that on an annualized basis, the GDP had declined by about 7.3% due to the rise in the consumption tax from 8% to 10%, as well as a major hurricane that had hit the major metropolitan areas. And so with this shock, it was inevitable that Japan was going to head into a major recession. And in fact, in the first quarter, the figures had already come out as of a couple of weeks ago, showing on an annualized basis a decline in GDP of about 3 to 4%. So there was that element of it. The reliance of Japan on Southeast Asian and China supply chains was inevitably going to be disrupted by this. And the fact that Japan, with Korea and other Southeast Asian nations, is a largely export-driven economy. And with the hit this crisis has placed on overall global consumer demand, it was inevitable that Japan was going to be hit pretty hard.
Right. No, I think that's true for any export-based economy. But I think one of a noise we are hearing that with the WTO already under stress, where not too many countries are willing to follow the multilateral arrangement, and then we are seeing another cracks emerging in WHO in the times of crisis, where a lot of large nations are not sort of fully agreeing with the guidelines WHO is coming up with. So the expectation is that the world is going to be more inward looking, and I understand that Japan for its manufacturing is largely dependent on China, and in India we are hearing a lot of viewpoint that possibly Japan partially shift out of China and the country like India may be a gainer in this arrangement. Do you think so that there is realistically going to be any move from China to many other countries in Asia, or it is too much a cost to move out of China for Japanese companies?
It's an interesting question. I think there are a number of reasons why Japan has an interest in shifting to India, not just for economic, but also for geopolitical reasons and strategic reasons. The issue with the interdependency with China is that there are several aspects to it. You're probably aware of the 1 trillion yen stimulus package that was approved by the cabinet, and a significant component of that, about 200 billion yen of that, was allocated to incentivize Japanese firms to relocate outside of China. That was seized upon by a lot of the media as a expression of a rejection of China as a manufacturing base. But the Japanese government officials will tell you that it's a risk hedging move in order to try to diversify supply chains.
Right.
And because of the reliance. And economists here will tell you that supply chain management has become so finely tuned, has become so precise,
Right.
that there's no room for error in terms of diversification, and that the system as a
Exactly.
whole probably
Right.
has more room for a little bit more inefficiency in order
Right.
to hedge against these sort of risks. And so, in
That's
that
right.
sense, being able to diversify into areas like India makes complete sense.
No, I think we certainly see India right now in also a desperate position because India, although committed a significant size, close to 10% of GDP as a stimulus, which is again a matter of debate whether it's a stimulus or it's lending. So that's debate can go on. But India is banking a lot on inward investment from Japan to see its economy going up. Uh, Coming to the impact on our fraternity, the lawyers in this, and you have experience of seeing the law firms in US and the law firms in Japan. Do you see that this lockdown is going to change the way Japanese law firms have been working? Because in my experience, I've not seen people working out of home in Japan. They're not very comfortable. And the way the houses are structured, possibly they are not of a great advantage to work from home. Do you see that the Japanese law firm adapting to this new change of work?
Your question really touches on a number of different interesting points about Japan and the legal profession, actually. Because you're well aware, even before this crisis hit, the legal profession was undergoing a lot of different challenges. There
Right,
was, on a macro level, the move to multidisciplinary practice, the impact of AI, um, on a number of different fronts.
right,
And in terms of socially, culturally, and infrastructurally,
right,
Japan is not well suited for a work at home environment. The homes are small. There
right,
is a relative lack of privacy.
right,
And the support system, social support system for things like um, child support and school support for dual working families with children is
right,
still at a very early stage of development. And
right,
so when you take the shifting landscape of the legal profession and you couple it with the social,
right,
cultural, I guess, limitations of working at home and place it in the context of the crisis, yes,
right,
it provides incredible amounts of challenges, both, well, principally on an individual level for the lawyers and all the other
right,
corporate workers, but it also places challenges for the employers as well. Um,
right.
Biggest costs for law firms are leases and
Absolutely.
technology support. And uh, in terms of technology support, there are going to be more demands placed on employers uh, as a result of this. Uh, there are going to be interesting choices that law firms are going to have to make about their commitments to leasing office space, long-term commitments along those
Right,
lines, and how much and to what extent they're going to divert their resources to technology.
right.
And it will change certain aspects of the way Japanese lawyers work. I mean, do we really need to have as many person-to-person client meetings as is typical?
Right.
And on the corporate front, is it really necessary for corporate presidents to go on regional site visits to every plant every month, as is
Right.
commonly practiced? So I think along all these different lines, we're bound to see changes, and some of these will likely be permanent.
I agree. I think, and this is very visible when you look at the law firms in US and the one particular deal, which is a fairly large size deal in Indian standards. Facebook acquired some close to 10% in Reliance in the Indian company, and the deal started sometime just before the lockdown. And I understand that this deal was carried out online and through remote measures. and that has worked very well. And I think the two of the leading US firms have done seamless job in this entire process. I understand the adaptability with the US firms is much higher, but I believe these US firms are also under stress for various reasons in US. You have any take on that, the US firms, how they're dealing with it?
Their challenges are pretty similar. I think one of the biggest issues for the future of the profession, at least in the medium term, will be the impact on the new graduates coming into the labor
Right,
force. The impact during the 2008-2009 financial crisis was very severe on that group, and it really hasn't recovered for them. We're facing something much larger now with this
right,
new group of recent graduates. So that will have inevitably a ripple effect. The last great challenge that firms were facing in terms of competition was when technology became part of the landscape, and it fundamentally affected the value that law firms deliver to their clients, because with the easy access to knowledge and the commoditization of knowledge, it was no longer sufficient to be a law school graduate and to be trained up in the rules, because the clients could look
right,
them up just as easily as the lawyers, and it fundamentally changed what the value proposition was for the profession. And the top firms adjusted well to that
right,
and were able to preserve their higher margin practices, whereas there was a
right,
large consolidation around the mid-tier firms and the firms that were more on the commoditized end of that market. I
right,
think with this crisis, there will be a new challenge beyond
right,
that, which will start focusing on efficiencies,
right,
great pressures on the billing model, and
right,
firms will have to follow their clients and ways they attacked in terms of innovation and globalization. So
right.
I think we are potentially facing a new unknown horizon where it's going to be harder for law firm
Absolutely.
leadership to be able to look around corners and figure out where this is all going.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think we need to see that how the next generation is going to see legal profession, whether it is as sought after as we saw in last 2 decades, it remains the same attractive profession or not. I think we all need to see that what happens after COVID. But I think you talked about the role of leadership, and I think if we talk role of leadership at two different levels, one is that what we are seeing at each respective country leadership is behaving and dealing with this current crisis in a very different manner. And I think the style of leadership is producing very different results. That's one level. I think the second level, where all these at the organization level, at the law firms level, I think it is becoming extremely critical that the leadership takes charge of the situation and take the entire organization through these crises. And I think at both the level, the leadership is going to play a very critical role. And we have some examples of Germany and Korea, they've done so well. I think your viewpoint would be very relevant on both the aspects.
These are fascinating points that you raise. I think at a government level, leadership is very critical, and there are opportunities in Asia coming out of this crisis.
Right,
There, you had touched upon a question about potential looking reactions,
right,
isolationism. Um, Asia, with its deep historical differences, are inevitably going to push countries apart. But there are huge areas of cooperation here on
right,
healthcare, managing supply chains, even security, to the extent there's a spillover effect in North Korea, for example.
right,
And the Asian countries, the principal ones, unfortunately, don't seem to be able to manage these cooperative opportunities on their own. And this is where
right,
US leadership can really play a significant role. But
exactly.
unfortunately, it's not materializing. Um,
That's right.
on a local government level in
Yeah,
Japan, the interesting question is how effective the government response will be. 25% of the Japanese population is over 65 years old, and that is the most vulnerable demographic for this particular disease. And there had already been things in the Japanese system on welfare costs as a result of the gradual lifetime employment in a system where corporations carried a large part of the welfare benefit burden that is all now being shifted to the Japanese government. So you have on top of that the massive healthcare overlay of the pandemic on this aging population, which also exacerbates the burdens of lack of tax revenue or declining tax revenue, increasing welfare costs, and so with the fiscal demands that are now being placed in response to the pandemic being on top of that, it really is about how Japan is going to be able to cope.
No, that's right. I think it's going to be all to be seen, but role of leadership is going to be very, very critical at all levels. And I think running these countries is not going to be easy in these critical times. We need to wait and watch how things go on. I think talking of, again, leadership on a... Sorry, please go on.
Well, one interesting point on that is that despite all challenges, the response actually has been pretty successful. If you look at data from earlier this month, the number of deaths per 100,000 population ranks very low. In fact, in Asia, it's below 1. If you look at Singapore, Korea, Japan, where New York City alone, the number of deaths per 100,000 is over 200.
That's right.
And for the U.S. as a whole, it's 15, and many of the European countries that were hit was in the 40s or 50s. But the popularity of the Japanese government has been declining precipitously. The percentage of Japanese who disapprove of the way the Abe cabinet has handled this crisis is almost 60%, according to a poll that just came out a week or two ago. And it's been declining. These are significant declines, and there are a number of reasons for this, but it's been an interesting reaction in terms of the Japanese people's view of their own government's response, notwithstanding the fact that Japan has actually come out pretty well.
Right. No, I think that's is going to be true for most of the countries. If you see, these governments are dealing with a very, very difficult job right now, very unknown enemy they are dealing with. So the chances are the results are going to be very diverse across the world, and irrespective of the role and responsibility of the government, I think they are up for a lot of criticism and all around. I think that's going to happen for sure. But I think reality is going to hit after a couple of months when the results will be out and they'll start behaving on economic front. I think that's going to balance out the view which is prevailing today and possibly after another 6 months. So I think the view may shift after in a short run. That's what I expect. But I think one more critical part which I see, and especially from the Japan point of view, SoftBank has been one of the very aggressive, unlike Japanese investor all around the world. And till last year, I think the model adopted by SoftBank and Sonsan was never failing model. Do you see that what's currently these investments are going on, and investments like WeWork and all this, do you see that aggression of SoftBank and likes of SoftBank in Japan going down, and they'll follow their conservative model of investments in other countries around the world?
SoftBank is an interesting example. I'm not as close to the Japanese market reaction, but I can say from the US that there are some pretty significant differences from what happened during the 08-09 financial crisis in terms of access to capital and credit. It's been very resilient because the financial system is still very healthy. partly as a result of the lessons from the prior crisis, whereas it was the financial system itself, which was the cause of the difficulties before.
Right.
Now, SoftBank happens to be in a part of the market that
Right.
relies heavily on credit.
Exactly.
Placing the company like that in the Japanese context, SoftBank has always been very highly leveraged and has always depended relatively heavily on the public markets. It's not
Right.
a traditional Japanese establishment corporate bank borrowing
Right.
entity.
Right.
So as long as the public markets are healthy, uh, you know, it doesn't feel like an environment yet
Right.
that they would be adversely impacted. They also happen to be exposed, though, to a very vulnerable part of
Right.
uh, the investment market. WeWork is a real estate company, basically, and
Right.
Uber is a transportation company, and
Right.
of course, retail and transportation and you know those segments of the economy are the ones that are getting worst hit by all of this.
Right. Right.
So it does raise the question, is this a temporary setback that is unique to SoftBank because
Right. Right.
how they've been exposed. Um,
Right.
they're not completely vulnerable because the credit markets are still relatively healthy and functioning. So
Right.
I don't know to what extent you can take that model, extrapolate it out, and see how it might affect the landscape of corporations generally.
Right. Right. No, I think
There have,
the SoftBank is unique.
yeah, and there haven't been, as for funds, which is really what SoftBank is, uh, the at least the private equity market here, the professionals are saying that uh, it is business as usual in the sense that uh, for patient capital, they do see opportunities out there.
Right.
Um, they have to be more careful, more nimble. But
Right.
interestingly, investors are not um, resisting capital calls, and they're not giving any indication at all to these, at least the top tier fund managers, that they are reluctant in any way to continue investing.
Right.
So that that is, if you want to extrapolate, then for companies like SoftBank,
Right.
perhaps there is room for patience here.
I certainly agree. And I think these crises, I understand, are going to open up a lot of new avenues and new opportunities. And currently, I think the pharmaceutical is going to be one area where we're going to see a lot of action coming in next couple of months for sure. And at the same time, I think the valuations are fairly low in spite of very healthy companies being floating around. And you being yourself a champion on the M&A side and you're teaching in M&A now, do you see there's going to be spurt of massive merger and acquisition post-COVID, or at least once we have a little more clarity on this in US as well as in Japan? And especially from the point of view, I understand a couple of US companies have started acquiring real estate in Japan, which to my mind is a fairly unusual thing.
Well, there are indications that deals still are closing, uh, including significant deals.
Right.
It, for large strategic acquisitions, leaving aside opportunistic acquisitions, it seems that the uncertainty is not going to help uh,
Right.
with confidence in doing
Right.
transactions of
Right.
scale.
Right.
Um, it's it's also very hard to commit to valuations in this market, at least until there's a little bit more stability. And without the ability to price confidently, it's hard
That's
to
right.
see a wave of acquisitions coming out of this, at least until things settle down.
Right. Right. No, that's right. I think even the lot of countries at the legislation level or the regulatory level, I think they are trying to stall these cheap acquisition because of the lowering of values. And Europe and India, we have seen specifically again the Chinese investment. India has changed the foreign investment policy by restraining the acquisitions which were under auto mode. They have shifted them to the approval mode, which means the government of India can look into those kind of acquisitions. But you're right. I think there are going to be various barriers which are coming in because otherwise it looks like the deep-pocketed corporations can eat out the smaller or the highly low-valued companies. I completely agree. I think this has been very helpful talk. I think let me come to my last and the favorite question. I think you've been talking at a multiple forum about Carlos Ghosn, and people are questioning about the criminal judicial system in Japan. And we can't let you go without commenting on that. And from the point of view that the conviction rate is so high in Japan, everybody dread that if you're on the wrong side in Japan, you're certainly going to go behind bars.
Yes, this has been a widely discussed topic. And it is a reflection of the differences in approach to criminal justice, without a doubt. When you look at the high conviction rates, one has to question how those are calculated and what accounts for the converse calculation, which is the very low acquittal rate, which is really what the conviction rate represents. And the only thing I can say about it, I guess, I can go on forever about it, but to be a little more concise about it is that if you compare it to the US model in terms of how the system is administered, the US model is a very crime control centered, arrest and detention and incarceration focused system.
Right.
And a lot of Europeans look at the American system and can't believe what goes on here. And what doesn't get counted in the calculations on US acquittal rates is the fact that a vast majority of cases are plea bargained, where the trial stage isn't even a trial and conviction, it's merely a sentencing procedure.
Right.
Whereas Japan is a much more cooperation, conciliation focused system.
Right.
A huge amount of discretion is granted to prosecutors. And when you look at that system where rehabilitation and reintegration of the accused and suspects is more central and is more subtle than the brute approach in the US, you actually see the number of cases that are brought is relatively low. And that most of prosecutorial decisions are based on conciliation efforts between victims and suspects.
Right.
And that results in, that is one of the root causes of why there's so few cases brought in Japan. But among the minority of cases that are actually brought, they are only brought because the proof in the minds of the prosecutors, at least, is overwhelming in favor of guilt. So but on the other hand, the incarceration rates and actual arrest rates in Japan are much lower than it is in the US. And the system for the Japanese works.
Right.
The incarceration rates are at per 100,000 of the population is higher than in Russia.
That's right.
And the US has just under 5% of the world population, but it has almost 25% of the world's incarcerated population. So when you look at it from multiple perspectives, it does raise the question, is there a right system? Or is it a matter of systems that work for different societies? And that 9% conviction rate, number one, what does it really mean? What is a a trial? What
Exactly.
is an arrest? And how
Right.
does it all get calculated? And if you can do an apples to apples comparison, do the numbers really match up? Is it
Right.
really that different? So those are the questions that I raise in when I think about the issue.
No, that's right. It's very misleading to say that the conviction rate is beyond 90%. And I think if we see it from other perspective, Japanese society is a very law-abiding society, and people inherently follow law. Whereas if you see, I think the value of liberty is really traded very high in US. And the classic times are when we are seeing that the governor orders are flouted, people are walking out without mask, no social distancing. So I think that itself shows that the social and cultural difference is so huge that the laws are accordingly molded. And when you find that very rare number of cases you find who reach a point where you have to count your conviction, is not a true judgment when we compare with the rest of the world in terms of conviction rate of the entire world. No, I completely agree. I think somebody need to culturally understand that what we are referring to, and statistically that at what level the two are comparable. I think I completely understand that part. No, but it's been a pleasure talking to you. Thank you very much. And I hope we all get out of this very soon. And I look forward to seeing you whenever I get a chance, either in Japan or maybe in US. And similarly, if you get a chance to travel to India, please be my guest, and I hope to see you soon.
Balbir, thank you again for this wonderful opportunity to speak with you and to catch up again. It's always a pleasure, and I wish you and your family well and healthy. And I do look forward to seeing you again soon.
Thank you very much. Thank you.